Okay, so what we're gonna do is just take a look at your swim, and I'm looking for, when I do analysis on swims, I look for three things. And you know some of these because you've been through some of our sequences, our drill sequences. But for the sake of just kind of going over them, I look for balance in the water, and I'll explain each of these as we go. Balance in the water, how you're propelling yourself, and we want that to be a core-driven stroke rather than arm and leg. And then what we call our switch timing, which is how your arms sequence in to help your hips propel you forward. So we'll kind of go through each of those as we go. And we'll first let you just take a look, full speed, and then we'll slow it down and draw some lines and talk about some specific things. So if there's anything that stands out to you as we go. All right. Beautiful streamlines. Love the swoops. Love the streamlines. Super nice off the wall. All right, we'll get you into your stroke here for just a second or two so we can see some things.
Kind of peel off to the left.
Yeah, a little bit. Okay, so this is where we start, right? So this is what we call our side glide position. This is when you are in your most hydrodynamic. And so basically what we're looking for is straight body lines. So if we draw lines that are as parallel to my lane line, because that's effectively straight as I can get them, then that starts to tell us what the body alignment looks like. And so ideally what we want to see is we want to see lead hands on that line, we want to see underarm on that line, we want to see bottom hip on that line, and we want to see bottom foot on that line. And so this is actually really quite nice. We're pretty nice and straight. We have beautiful extension. I love your extension in this lead arm, reaching and extending towards that far wall. That's super nice. So with a body position that is this good, then we start looking for some more fine-tuned things. And so what I look for next is I look for spinal alignment. Okay. And so this is where we can maybe get a little bit better sense of what that body alignment looks like. And we want that spine to literally be straight. So as lengthened and as extended as we can get it. And the primary place that we start with when we look at alignments and getting this body balanced, okay, is this idea of head position. So when a body is balanced in the water, you're going to have your top shoulder, you're going to have your top hip, and you're going to have your top foot all at the surface. And what that means is that body is straight in the water, flat to the surface, and balanced. A balanced body means we have the least amount of drag, of course. Oftentimes we have bodies that angle and sit in the water with high chest, low hips, and that's where we start the work. So in your case, we have just a little bit of a balance adjustment. You're really quite nicely balanced. The body line is pretty well straight, but we can start to do some fine tuning on you, right? Because you already have some experience with this. So primarily, we're going to start right here. So there's a little bit of a space between the top of the head and the arm. And so the way that we want to correct that is by lowering the forehead. So this idea that we literally want to have those eyes looking straight to the bottom of the pool and not angled forward at all. Very different than what a human body wants to do, of course. And so for you, it's a matter of just lowering that forehead down just a little bit, and that will tend to close this space up. The other thing that will do is when that head lowers, then the spine gets a little straighter, and then what that will also do is lift the hips just a little bit more. And so if we look at your body alignment here, we can see that your shoulders out of the water, your hips are super close to the surface, but they're not actually out. Okay. And so anything we can do to bring that front end down will help lift the back end up. Because of course in our bodies, we have a teeter-totter effect in the water, fulcrum point through the belly button. This is your light half here with the lungs, obviously, that wants to be high in the water. And this, of course, not saying anything about your body weight, because obviously you are awesomely in shape, but our lower half is always the heavy part, and that part wants to sink. So the body literally works like a teeter-totter with one half working opposite the other half. So if we can take this light half and just kind of bring it down just a little bit more, and primarily we start with head position, then the heavy half will tend to lift up to the surface, and then we'll have a really, really nice alignment. Okay? But suffice to say, Ellen, I mean, your balance looks really good to start with. Oftentimes, we'll see people that look like that in the water. So you obviously are not in that scenario. Okay? So balance is first. Let's just kind of step it through here and see if there's anything else with balance that we see. If there's anywhere, oftentimes we'll see balance adjustments at the breath. Okay, so that's a nice one to look at right there. So again, if we draw those lines roughly parallel. So here you can see that when you breathe, we actually get more of a balance shift. So we get more of a head lift. And you can see, if we look at our red line, right, so the hand is now pretty far off that line. The underarm is pretty far off that line. The hips and legs are right on, which is great. But we've had just a little bit of a shift here in this upper body angle. And that often happens at breath. So more complicated concepts of how do we breathe without lifting our head. We ideally want to do that as a rotational thing, using the hips to breathe. But that takes a little bit more work to get that head to stay in line like that. But suffice to say, right, that's important, because if we have an alignment that shifts like this, now we start to get drag points right here. We start to get a little drag off of this lower ends, and then we get drag off the head too. So a couple different places that we increase that resistance. If you have questions or comments, please jump in. So don't feel like you have to be quiet. All right. Next thing we look for, aside from balance, or second thing, so I would say, let's do it this way. One is balance. Okay. Number two is what we call core rotation. And so this is how you actually propel yourself forward. And typically, as humans, we use our arms and legs to do that. So we want to see the hips and the core activate and create that forward propulsion. It's about 75% of your propulsive power comes from your hip drive. So what that means is if we are in our side glide, which would be this position here, where we are effectively reaching that arm forward, we would want to see this whole body be stacked up on its side. So we would want to see your whole shoulders, like both shoulders stacked, both hips stacked, feet basically stacked up so that they are parallel to the surface, not perpendicular to the surface of the water. And that would be what we would consider our side glide position. On your side, reaching forward, that's our super hydrodynamic position. So from this angle, it's reasonable rotation. I would probably suggest a little bit more rotation just to be a little bit more on your side. And I particularly will say that because of how the arm comes forward. So if we notice when your arm comes forward, it's really flat, okay? Meaning that we don't necessarily have the elbow higher than the hands as that recovery process happens. And what that tells me is when I see the hands and the elbow basically at the same height, so meaning this and this are roughly at the same height versus high elbow, low hands, then that tells me that we're pretty flat. So for that arm to come forward in a flatter angle means that the body is also flat too. So
what's the benefit? Does it engage my lats more if I have my elbow higher?
So the primary benefit is going to be twofold. So one, if that we have a high elbow, low hand recovery, then the only way that you're able to do that is when you're more on your side. And if you're more on your side, then we get more hip power when we rotate to the next side. So when the hips flatten like this, then the hip power is reduced because now you have to kick and pull your way around to the other side versus being able to just drive those hips and rotate them fully. So I always kind of think of that's first. Secondary, when the arm comes in flat like this into the water, it has to press down. And then pressing down on a straight arm is one of the primary reasons why people get shoulder pain. because that is really hard on the shoulders. Plus, it's not very hydrodynamic because now we're creating, this long lever that's pressing down in the water, as opposed to a angle that can allow you to reach and spear and extend the water. So it's
little guys. They're not very strong.
It's multiple things. So it's first and foremost, it flattens your hips out, or your hips flatten because the arm is like that, or your arm is flat because the hips are like that, hips are flat. So we generally have less hip motion when we see flat arms. And then secondly, it's really hard on shoulders and hydrodynamics. So I think the other side looks a little bit different, which we'll take a look at. But anyway, those are all to say that on this side, which we would call your left side because your left arm is extended, your left side is a little bit flat. And I'd like to see more hip rotation on this side. Okay, so all that was by way of saying that your hips are a little bit flat on this side. So if we go then to the other side, the other thing that tells me you're flat is when I see feet come out of the water. Right there, that tells me also that we're a little bit flat. So there's a couple different indicators there of being too flat and not enough on that side. Okay, so we want full sides. We want to be stacked all the way up on one side, and then we're going to go all the way up on the other side. This is your breathing side, so we see better rotation. That's typically what we see. So now you can see hips are stacked. Hips are pretty well stacked up. Shoulders are pretty well stacked up. Okay, feet are a little bit more stacked up. So this position looks much better. Okay, and typically when people breathe, they rotate better. And so what we want to do is basically have the same rotation on both sides, regardless of if you're breathing or not, if that makes sense. And basically, that concept is, again, that if we have our hips stacked here and our shoulders stacked here, then the next thing that happens is we rotate both of those together as we switch to the other side, and that's where the propulsive power comes from, that act of driving those hips from one side to the other. Okay? And that's, again, most of our propulsive power comes from that action. And then the arms and legs are essentially secondary helpers to the hips rather than the prime movers, if that makes sense. Okay? When we see less hip rotation, we see more pulling and kicking. Okay? And that's why I was kind of asking you how fast you were swimming, if you could slow it down a notch, because this is a lot of kicking for a Ironman swim, particularly. So that's one of the ways that we reduce the kicking is by getting our hips more involved. Then you don't have to kick as much, and the arms don't have to do as much either. So yeah, okay. So we have balance was first. Second is hip rotation. Okay. And then, or core activation is another way we say it. And then the third thing is a little more complicated. This is how we sequence the arms into that hip rotation. So if swimmers are flatter, less hip rotation, you're going to see more windmill arms. You're going to see arms that are acting more like windmills, where they're equal and opposite each other, which is, unfortunately, the way humans are programmed to move. So one of the biggest pieces to a more efficient swim stroke is changing the way those arms want to move. It's a little more complicated, a little bit more challenging to do, but the drill sequences that we use do that. So we'll take a look at how the arms are moving right now. And you've had some experience with this, so I would not expect to see windmill arms on you, and we don't. So there's one arm, here's another arm, okay? So what we mean by windmill would be this arm is in one position while the other arm would be exactly in the opposite position. That would be a windmill stroke. That's what we see on really new swimmers. You are not new. You've had some experience with this, so we wouldn't expect to see that on you. But what we'll look at is your time. Does your timing need some little adjustments? Need some fine tuning? Okay, so what that means. So if we have a beautiful side glide here, which we do, this is really nice. Okay, there's our side glide. Lead arm reaching forward. Good rotation on the shoulders. Good rotation on the hips. Okay, so that's our beautiful position. Essentially what we want to do is we want to hold that position, because that's our most hydrodynamic position, as long as possible without compromising the forward mechanics of the stroke. So what that means is we want to stay in this position with this arm extending, these shoulders and hips stacked all the way until that recovery arm, which is this one right here, until that recovery arm gets to entry point. So what that means is this arm is extending, shoulders and hips stacked, all the way until this hand is at entry, which is right there. Okay? So on this side, you do that pretty nicely. We have more rotation on this side, so this is a better position all the way around. So even though the arm is dropped a little bit, it's not down here, so that's good. I would love to see it still reaching and extending forward. But you can see on this side you have that high elbow, low hands position, which is great. When you're on your side, you're going to be able to do that more so. And this is essentially what we call our switch point position. So what we want to see is we want to see essentially from our side glide here, we want to see no body. The only thing moving right now is going to be that recovery arm coming into position. Everything else stays exactly the same. So as we step that forward, so you can see right here that your hip angle is now a little different than it was back here. Okay, so sorry, that's a little blurry. I don't know how to get the blurry part out of there, but so here's our angle here, and then as we step that forward, when we see the lead arm drop, we usually see the hips start to rotate. So you can see right here that now the angle it's a little bit flatter on those hips. Shoulders are still stacked, but a little flatter on the hips than we were a few frames forward. And so what we want is ideally those hips to stay totally still without rolling at all until we are ready for them to roll, which is the very next step from this position here. So it's this idea of, again, holding those sideline positions, keeping that lead arm extended all the way until we are literally with this hand at entry, which is right there. Okay. And then what we do is we make our switch. And that means now we roll the hips, we roll the shoulders, this arm goes into extension, this arm comes back to the hip. And that's what we call the switch. And that should happen all as one motion, all in sequence, all at one time. Okay, so then we would get all the way to our other side glide here. And again, that idea of rolling those hips, changing the arms, switching the arms, that's our forward propulsive mechanism in this stroke. So little bit of adjustment on that side in terms of holding those hips a little bit more still, keeping that lead arm reaching and extending. Let's see what this current side looks like. And I'm going to get you off of a breath because breaths are always challenging. So, and actually that's a really good visual right there. So here's our entry points, right? And if we had this position perfect, this arm right here would still be reaching forward, we'd be fully on our side still. So it happens regardless of breath or not. But I will say that when we breathe, it's much harder to hold that. So let's take a look and see if we can get a non-breath. Okay, wait, here we go. This is what I want right here. No, to the other side, this is what I want. Confusion, sides, there, okay. So here's our side glide. This hand is a little bit high. We'd let that hand to be down here, reaching forward. Fully on our side, which we've already talked about. And so let's see what happens as we make this switch. So you can see that lead arm's already disappearing. There's our switch point position. So again, we were a little flatter on this side, so we're not seeing the amount of rotation that we ideally would want in this position, but little bit better on that elbow to hand angle, and you can see your lead arm is right there. So this side loses that, what we call switch timing sideline position, just a little bit sooner than the other side, because it's a little flatter, if that makes sense.
It's interesting because I thought it was the other side that was slowing me down.
Interesting.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Yeah. So it's just like for you, it's just little tweaks and kind of remembering those drills.
Mm-hmm.
and practicing those drills, which I don't know when the last time you practiced your single switches or your switch point holds or any of those kind of drills when you did those last. But that's what I would say.
So long.
That's what I would say. I mean,
That's crossed my mind.
it looks really good. You have a really, really nice swim. And so for you, it's literally just refining rather than learning new things from the get-go. So, yeah. So anyway, I hope that
Rotate and
helps.
stay.
Yeah, all the way on your side. Get those sides equal. Get that head down a little bit more. Hold your sideline positions. And fingertip drag, yeah. So, you know all that stuff. So, awesome. Nice job, Miss Ellen.